I went off the grid with my ex in 2020, and I ended up living on my property alone by 2021. When we broke up, my ex ended up in jail, and he had a temporary restraining order put on him for 2 weeks. That gave me 2 weeks to decide what I was going to do. Now, at the time, we were living in his camper. I was working for him with his business. So when we broke up, I was going to lose my home and my only source of income. I really only had a couple of options. I could either tuck my tail in between my legs and go live with my mom, or I could move into a shed on my property and rough it. I decided to rough it, and I chose the shed. This shed is 9 by 12, so the internal living space is about 100 square feet. It was not insulated at the time. There were no windows installed. It is placed completely flat on the ground, and I didn't have the time or money to make it livable, but I moved into it anyways. I just chalked it up to it being a fun camping experience. Now, when I moved into the shed, I figured it was going to be a temporary situation. I'd only be in the shed for 6 months. Somehow, some way, I'd land some great job. I would start my own homestead-based business, and I'd be able to afford to build something nicer, build a cabin, maybe get a really nice RV, and ride off into the sunset. But that is exactly what didn't happen. What has happened since then is I have been living in my 9 by 12 shed for 4 years now. And these 4 years have been pretty rough on me. But over time, I started to make my shed more comfortable and more livable. So let's take a look inside. Now I'm going to give you a tour of how I live in such a tiny space. This is my kitchen area. I actually cook pretty much every single meal that I eat. This is a very small, low wattage microwave, and this thing right here, this is a lifesaver. This toaster oven is basically a mini oven. I can cook all kinds of different things in here. It does fit a 12-inch pizza. This is my coffee making area. This is a larger than normal mini fridge, and I'm glad I got it because I've got enough room to make things work. It would be a little difficult with 2 people, but with 1 person, I can put enough food in here for a week. Over here is where all the cooking happens. I do use a cooktop with butane. I also have an electrical skillet that works really good. This is pretty much my indoor water. I've got this basin down here. When I need water inside, that's pretty much what it is. And I do clean this thing out every 2 to 3 days because it does get gross. I have lots of spices that are organized in these tiny little baskets. And then I have this old beat up thing that I've had forever that just has my silverware, my dry goods, and storage stuff. Up here is where I keep all of my pots and pans. This is a vegetable steamer. It works so freaking good. And then this is where I have all of my dishes, which are not much. This is how I get my dirty dishes in and out of the tiny house. Now, this is my bed. I love this thing because this kind of makes it an area where I can recline and relax without having to lay down. You could get a futon here, and I did have a futon for a really long time, but it was super cheap and it started messing with my sleep. Over here, this is normally my beauty area where I have lotions, makeup, and all that stuff. I sacrificed my beauty area for my grow area because it is more important to grow food. Then I have my home office, which is super important. Down here under my office is my hamper, and then I have this little storage area for dry goods. On top of this area is my closet, and I have basically a very small wardrobe that I live off of. I do change it out by the seasons. I do have a lot of clothes that are put away. I also have my jewelry station. I like to wear jewelry. Now, if you guys are liking what I'm putting down, I have a free off-grid simple living newsletter, and when you sign up, you'll get my free guide, How to Purchase Off-Grid Property, rusticskills.com/newsletter. No, I don't want you on the bed because you stink. Get out. Because you rolled in something stinky outside. This very nice vertical shelving area, mainly for shoes. And then I have more shoes here because, you know, shoes. And then that's my little doggy food and water station. And then hiding behind here is my vacuum. I use a vacuum once or twice a day because it's such a small space. I pretty much live outdoors. I'm constantly tracking stuff in between me and my dog. Now, this one is for the ladies. I do not want to go outside in the middle of the night and go pee, so I got this contraption here, which is a female urinal. And basically, you tuck it into your crotch and you go pee. So at night, instead of having to go outside, I just use this, and I have this container here that I go pee in, and that's how I go to the bathroom at night. This is my outdoor addition that I built, and this is pretty critical when you're living in such a small space. You're gonna have to live a lot of your life outdoors. So I have a deep freeze here, a sink for washing dishes, brushing my teeth, etc. Over here is my outdoor latrine. Underneath is a 4-gallon electric point-of-use water heater. It is very efficient, it works super good, and even when it is cold out, it pumps out super hot water. As far as doing my serious business goes, I just use a bucket. Pretty plain and simple. As you can see, there is some mud on the bucket, and that is from the javelinas coming in and sticking their little muddy noses all over my bucket, being curious. I use these composting bags, and I get them online for super cheap. I want to say it's like 5 cents a bag. I put that in my bucket, do my business, and then I just chuck it in the trash, and then I haul my own trash. Hi. I used to use this bucket here, and it had a toilet lid on it, and it actually has a hole cut out on the bottom. And what I used to do is I would dig a hole, and then I'd do my business, and I would cover that hole back up. Mother Nature composted my waste very quickly and very efficiently. The only reason that I stopped doing this method is because I got a dog, and she liked to come out here and dig up my holes, which is super gross. So I ended up using the bucket with the bags. Now, if you do this natural composting method, make sure to not bury your toilet paper because it doesn't compost nearly as fast. I was able to dig a hole where I had previously used a hole in only 2 weeks, and everything was already composted back into the earth. Is it because you rolled in a dead animal? Is that why you're getting a bath? You ready for a bath? Good doggy. Well, guys, I did it. I have finally moved out of my tiny shed, and it feels freaking amazing. I lived in this shed for 4 years. It is literally the size of a prison cell. I don't know what the size of a prison cell is, but I don't even think it's this tiny, to be honest. At least in prison, they have an indoor toilet and a sink. I remember when I first moved into my shed, the first night was terrifying. The first month or two, I was having a hard time adjusting. I definitely thought about leaving, but I just forced myself. I forced myself to stay and to adjust, and I got used to it, but I always had my pistol by the side of my bed, and I still do. Let's talk about building materials. So behind these panels, I used a mid-range standard bat insulation, and that costed about $500. And then over the insulation, I put these MDF panels, which stands for medium density fiberboard. And do not use these panels. These panels are absolutely horrendous. If you put anything through these panels, it makes a huge hole. If you put a nail hole or you use a screw, you cannot repair the hole. It will always look like shit. If the panels get wet, they swell and they stain, and there's nothing you can do about it. And God forbid you put any tape on the walls, because if you put anything that sticks to this wall, it will rip off the finishing, and you can't replicate this. Once this slick surface comes off, it's basically cardboard underneath, and you can't paint on it, you can't repair it. So I suggest staying clear away from these boards. Now, the only reason I use these panels is because I did this renovation by myself, and they were very light. I could handle them by myself. I didn't have to rely on somebody else to help me install them. If I had to do it again, I would have just gotten plywood, and I would have just plywooded the whole thing and painted it. But you know, those boards are heavy for a single woman to install. And the panels were kind of cheap, actually. I want to say they were $20 a piece. It didn't a pinch short term, but long term, I have half a mind to rip them out. I'm not going to because it doesn't matter at this point, but they totally suck. For the ceiling, I did use a foam board. And the reason I did that is because it was very easy to stick the foam board up into the rafters. And I didn't cover the rafters because if I covered it, it would have made the tiny house feel even more tiny. The foam board is not cheap, but because it was such a tiny space, it didn't make a huge dent in my bucket. And then in my budget. And then I just painted them white to kind of open up the room. And for the floor, I ended up using these square carpet tiles. They have a sticky back to them, so all you have to do is peel off the plastic and stick them down. So that was a super easy install, and I went with the cheapest carpet I could possibly find. So overall, between the batt insulation in the walls, the foam board insulation in the ceiling, the panels that I put up, all of the trim work that I put up to cover up the seams of the panels, it cost me about $1,000 to fully insulate and finish the shed inside. Now let's talk about electrical. So the electrical was already installed when I got this shed. I did have to install these lights. There is a small 20 amp breaker right here. Now, if you're starting from scratch and you're doing the electric yourself, I definitely recommend doing a 30 amp breaker and running a large enough gauge wire to handle 30 amps. You'll be so glad with that extra 30 amps, trust me. I could only run 2 things at a time that made heat or cool. Now, toggling between 2 things that create heat or cold, it really isn't that big of a deal, but you'd be surprised at how many things you could run that could easily pop your 20 amp breaker. It does not take much. And then for cooling, I have this very basic wall air conditioner. It works great because it's such a tiny space. And then for when it gets cold out, which yes, it gets very cold in the desert at night, I just had this little infrared electric space heater. Now you may be wondering, how the heck did my tiny house manage the load of all of these electrical appliances? Most people living off grid depend on propane appliances, so they don't have so much of an electrical load. Well, the reason I was able to run so many electronics is because my ex and I purchased a very humongous solar power system that cost us a small fortune, because when we lived in the camper, that thing took up tons of power. We lived in a 50 amp camper that was running 2 ACs. That thing took up an incredible amount of power. We were definitely underestimating putting that 40-foot RV off grid. So when my ex left, I inherited the solar power system and I had a crap ton of power at my disposal. So I was able to run all of these appliances. But now that I have moved into my cabin, my solar power system got moved along with it. And I have since then connected this shed to the shore power, because when I bought the property next door, I managed to get the well and the power pole that came with the property. And that is something that I have discussed in a previous video that you might want to check out. It's about how I managed to acquisition this land and acquisition the parcel next to me, including getting that well and the power pole. So if I were to tally all of the expenses for the electronics in here, including the lights, the switches, the cable, the breaker box, and the AC, I would be spending these days probably about another $500. So if you were to replicate what I built today in these times, this interior out the door would cost you probably about $1,500. Now let's talk about my window. This thing is basically crap. When I moved into this cabin, as you know, I only had 2 weeks to get everything out of my ex's RV. I had been living in that RV for 6 years. I knew I needed to put a window into this shed, but for one, I didn't have any carpentry skills, and for 2, I didn't have any money. So I had to go with the cheapest stuff I could possibly find. So I managed to cut this humongous hole into the door, which was not supposed to be even half as big as it is. But when I started cutting it with my Sawzall, it kept coming out crooked. So I'd have to take a little more off, and I'd have to take a little more off. And before I knew it, I'm like, okay, this hole is entirely too big, and my plexiglass barely covered it. I managed to do it, but barely. Now, the unintended consequence of making a window like this is that the hole is so big, it has caused my entire shed door to warp, which caused so much more dust and so much more bugs and even water to leak into my shed. So that was an awful building decision. If you are going to put a window in to your shed, than actually frame a window out and put in a real window, because this doesn't even open. But when you're in a pickle, sometimes you just gotta do what you gotta do to survive. Now, I built this outdoor addition about 2 years in to living in the shed. Before I had this addition, all of my stuff was basically on the side of the shed, out in the elements, no protection. This addition changed the longevity of how long I could live in this situation. So as you can see here, I've got 2 4x4 posts on each side of the shed. Then I have these 2x4 beams that I put up, which hold these plastic roof panels. I went ahead and went with a clear plastic because I wanted the sunshine to come through, which is wonderful in the winter, but it really sucks in the summer. So what I want to do is I want to start tarping this in the summer so I'm not boiling alive in this addition. I put in these pieces of pallet wood, and the pallet wood was totally free, and I think it looks really cool. So the shell of the addition cost me about $500 in materials. It was definitely the best $500 I've spent in my entire life. Now, I highly recommend that you build a sink like this and have some hot water for yourself. I lived without hot water for over 2 years of being out here. Would I want to do it again? No, but I did it, and I'm still alive. So this is a 4-gallon point of use electric water heater from Vivor. If you have the capability to run the wattage that is required for this, I highly recommend it. It does take 1.4 kilowatts an hour, so it is kind of expensive on your solar system, but I think it's worth it. You could also do a propane water heater, but those are so much more expensive. I got this water heater for a little over $100 online. You can't beat it on the price, and it works so freaking good. The water actually gets scorching hot. I have it set on max right now. I'm actually going to turn it down to like 90% because it's way too insanely hot. Now, as far as your sink goes, these sink basins, do not buy these new because you can find used sink basins for $20 and sometimes even free. But I would not necessarily recommend buying the faucet used. You can get a faucet like this from Lowe's or Home Depot between $75 and $150. If you find one used, that's great, but there could be a leak in it. I just prefer to buy plumbing items new. Now, the top of the sink is also finished with pallet wood that I got for free. So the entire sink build, including the faucet, the basin, the water heater, the wood, came to about $400. So this entire addition that I put on the shed probably cost around between $900 to $1,000. So we're looking at, between all the interior stuff and all the exterior stuff, we are at about $2,500. Now let's talk about the actual shed that you're going to purchase to live in. So I actually got this 9x12 shed for basically free. I helped an old lady out to organize all of her storage, and she gave me the shed for free because she was trying to get rid of it. Now, if you were to go out and buy this shed, you could definitely find one of these used for about $3,000, maybe even down to $2,500. But you want to make sure to buy a stick-built shed. Do not buy a metal shed. Do not buy a plastic shed to live in. Make sure it is built with wood. That way you can insulate it. It is not wobbly. It will not blow away in a windstorm. A lot of you have emailed me with all kinds of cool, interesting ideas of alternative buildings to live in, but a metal or plastic shed is not one of them. Out the door, between the price of the shed itself, building the addition, you could do this entire thing. You can replicate what I have built between $5,000 to $6,000. You could probably buy between 30% and 50% of everything to build this out used, and then you're going to save a ton of money. So you can do this. You can live off-grid in your tiny little house for about $5,000. Now, that does not count how you are going to get water. That doesn't count how you are going to get power. These days, solar power has become so much more efficient and so much cheaper from when I went off grid that you could probably get a pretty decent solar setup for $2,000 to $3,000. You can just haul water from your local depot for the first 6 months of living on this land. My ex and I had to haul water, and that cost $20 a month at the local water depot, which was located at my local fire department. And if you need help trying to find your local water depot, all you got to do is call your fire department and they'll tell you the closest one near you. Factor in a small solar power build and factor in hauling water, you could probably do it. You could definitely do it under 10,000. You'd probably be closer to like 8,000. You know, you could buy a 4-acre parcel for 20 grand, 30 grand, depending on where you're at, of course. This can vary wildly. But I'd say on average, you could still find a 4-acre parcel for 20 grand. And then you get, you know, the shed build done for 5 grand. And then you spend another 5 grand on your utilities. So for $30,000, you could live off grid. You could definitely do it. I've heard of people living in tents, living in their vans, doing whatever it took. When you go off grid, you just have to be creative, and you might have to live uncomfortably for a while. But when you make these sacrifices and live uncomfortably and live super cheap and live without things you normally wouldn't live without, it is amazing the amount of money that you can accrue and save up in order to become more free, to have more financial freedom, to be free from the system that we were born into. And to me, that's worth more than anything in the world. The biggest pro for living in a situation like this is the money savings. Holy crap. You will save so much money. And every year that you live like this, it just starts to compound, which is what happened to me. The average of rents right now is between $1,500 to $2,000 a month. The average cost of a mortgage is between $2,500 and $3,500 a month. That doesn't even include utilities. I've been hearing insane numbers for utilities. I've been hearing people paying $400, $500, $600 just for their electric. That doesn't include their sewer, their water bill. Water bills in California, I heard, are running like $200 to $300 a month. It doesn't include your trash service. I don't have any of those bills out here. Let's just call it $2,000. Between your utilities and your rent, you're paying about $2,000 a month. That's $24,000 a year. Times that by 4 years, that's $96,000. That's $96,000 in 4 years that you are saving by not having to pay rent and not having to pay utilities. That is how I bankrolled my cabin build. That is how I paid off my land, how I paid off my truck. This is where the magic happens. If you can live uncomfortably in a small situation like this, you're going to save a shit ton of money. The second thing that I really liked about living in this tiny shed is it felt like a cocoon. I slept so good in this little space. Everything was cozy and comfortable, and I had everything set up just so everything made sense, and I just felt super comfortable in here once I got over the fear of living in a tiny shack in the middle of nowhere. There were also some very serious cons about living in this tiny space for so long, and the biggest, worst thing about living in this shed was the bugs. I was terrorized by bugs for 4 years. That would have been fun, huh? Waking up to that crawling across my face in the middle of the night. Oh yeah. Got his little things out and everything. Oh, look at he's rubbing them together. Oh God. I just acclimated to them. I actually got desensitized to the bugs. And out here in Arizona, we have humongous, freaky, gnarly bugs. They were relentless. I had a year where I had crickets that were just stuck in the walls. I like crickets, okay, when they're outside and they're chirping, summer evenings. But when they're in your house and they are chirping, they're actually pretty loud, and it was causing me to go insane. If you're moving into a situation like this, I do suggest spraying for bugs. I never did because I didn't want the toxins. I didn't want to hurt the ecology. But looking back, I probably should have sprayed for bugs. However, in the 4 years of being in here with all the creepy crawlies, I never got a single bug bite indoors. Isn't that crazy? It's like we coexisted together. What the hell? Another huge thing to prevent the bugs is to
put your cabin on a foundation or pilings and don't have it sit, just bare bones on the ground. And that's what I have. This cabin was just plopped on the ground. It was never meant to be lived in. It was supposed to be just this little she shed for me, but it ended up being my primary residence for 4 years. The next big con about being in this shed for so long is it was freaking terrifying. I'm not gonna lie, okay? When I moved onto this land, I have 30 acres out here. It is a lot of land. There are a lot of critters on this land. It is very wild. It's pretty remote. It is very dark. I had to acclimate living here by myself in a tiny space that is literally separated from the outdoors by this much. My walls are probably, I don't know, maybe this thick. So I feel like I just lived in nature. And at night, when the javelinas come in and they start fighting with themselves and they make these ungodly noises and there's all kinds of bumps in the night and we get massive monsoon storms out here with lightning and thunder and pouring rain and hail, being out here by myself in the dark, being very close to the border, your mind just runs wild with all the crazy things that could happen to you. But in the 4 years that I have lived out here, I have not had any animal attacks. I have not had any problems with the border being so close. I haven't even had problems with trespassers, at least at night. A lot of it was just stuff I made up in my head. A lot of the fear was self-created fear. I feel much more safe on my land than I do in any city or town, to be honest. The next crappy thing about living in this tiny space is that everything gets super dusty. And this is kind of like an Arizona problem and a placement problem because where I placed the shed, it just happens to be a lot of dirt. So when the dust blows, dust came in here and layered everything so quickly. It was so gross to deal with the dust. And then another con is that everything gets stinky because when you cook in a small space, it just sticks to all your clothes. If you're cooking anything greasy, if you're cooking any type of meat, if you're cooking with olive oil, anything, no matter what you do, your clothes are going to stink. So I felt like I was just stinky for 4 years of my life, and there wasn't much I could do about it. Overall, I am super happy and proud of myself for sticking it out and doing what I did because it completely changed my life. I would not be nearly as far ahead if I chose the traditional route of living. Because I made these sacrifices, because I lived in this shed, I was able to get light years ahead in my life. I am in my mid-40s. I'm 43 years old. I have 30 acres that are completely paid off. I have a cabin build that is completely custom and paid off that I paid out of pocket the whole way. I have a huge solar power system. I have a well. I have a shore power pole. I have a paid off truck. I have money in the bank. I mean, I have leapfrogged ahead from all of my peers because I made this humongous sacrifice. I didn't talk about it for a really long time because the very few people that I opened up to, when I did talk about it, they just judged me super critically. They said that I was living like a third worlder. They said I was living like a totally poor person. How could you live like that? You're dirty. You're disgusting. This is gross. Oh my God. I basically have had no dating life because what am I going to do? Bring a guy back to the love shack? I mean, living in a 9x12 shed is not conducive for dating. Even in my darkest moments, being terrified here inside the shed, going through some really cold night or some really hot day, I always focused on the end game. And the end game has always been to get completely debt-free, to have an off-grid homestead that I can call home for the rest of my life, to exit the financial system as much as I possibly can, to quit my job and be self-sufficient with income. These have always been my goals. And I'm on the last goal now. I have made it to where I'm on the final goal, and that is to be completely self-sufficient for my income, for my job. And I haven't gotten there yet. I want to make sure I'm making enough money each month that I know once I quit my job, I'm going to be taken care of. Everything is planned out from this point. So I am on a septic system and I officially have a flushing toilet that uses real water. It is one of the most exciting, luxurious things I've ever owned. I do have a septic drain field, so I don't have to worry about my septic system getting sucked out. Now, what I do is I dump a big container of plain yogurt down into my septic system about every 4 to 6 weeks, and this activates the natural microbiome in there and will break down all of the waste with the enzymes in the yogurt. I also don't flush my toilet paper down into my septic system because I like the fluffy, thick, yummy, luxurious toilet paper, so I just throw it in the trash. Now, you'll definitely want to stay tuned because in one of my next upcoming videos, I'm going to be talking about how much it actually cost to build out this entire cabin. And I'm going to be talking about how much my solar power system, my septic system, and all of my utilities cost to install on this land, including the cost of the land. So you definitely want to subscribe right now if this is something that interests you.
Now, my final question to you is, do you think you would be able to live like I did in order to achieve what I have? Would you live in a 9x12 shed with no indoor plumbing in exchange for being debt-free, for owning land, for having a nice cabin, for owning a nice big truck? Would you make that sacrifice for your future? Or do you think it's too much? What would you do to be able to be free from the system? How much does it matter to you? Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.